The night of November 29th, 2025, was supposed to be a celebration, one of those rare moments when a community shaken by hardship gathers to remind itself of joy. Inside a modest banquet hall on Lucille Avenue, families arrived with wrapped presents and trays of homemade food, greeting each other with hugs beneath strings of bright paper decorations. Children ran between tables, chasing balloons, laughing, and waiting for cake. For a moment, it felt like Stockton had carved out a pocket of peace. No one inside that hall could have imagined how quickly it would all turn to terror. At 8:05 p.m., as the birthday song was preparing to be sung, gunfire shattered the night. Witnesses later recalled the same thing. The sound was deafening, far louder than they could have imagined possible indoors. Bullets tore through the banquet hall with brutal precision, glass shattering, tables splintering, families diving to the floor as chaos swallowed what had been a celebration just seconds earlier. The attack lasted less than a minute, but in that minute, lives were ended, futures stolen, and an entire city shaken to its core. When the gunfire stopped, 4 people lay dead, 3 of them children. An 8-year-old girl who loved drawing and dancing, a 9-year-old child whose parents had spent weeks planning the party, a 14-year-old boy who had dreams of playing football, and a 21-year-old man who had only come to support a family friend. At least 11 others were wounded, some critically, some so young they couldn't understand what had happened to them. By the time police arrived, the shooters were long gone. Outside, sirens wailed. Inside, parents screamed for their children in the smoke and confusion. Cell phone cameras captured panicked survivors carrying the injured out into the parking lot, their hands covered in blood. A police officer who responded said later that it was one of the worst scenes he had witnessed in his entire career. A birthday party, something so innocent, so ordinary, had become a battlefield. In the hours that followed, the city of Stockton was plunged into shock. Social media exploded with rumors and desperate cries for information. Families rushed to the hospital only to learn the unthinkable. Reporters crowded the police tape lines outside the banquet hall as detectives worked the scene deep into the night, marking dozens of shell casings on the ground. By dawn, the truth began to emerge. This was not a random act of violence. It was a targeted attack, an escalation in what Stockton's mayor, Christina Fugazi, would publicly confirm as gang-related violence. In a trembling voice, she stood before cameras and told the nation, "This city is grieving, and we are furious. Children were murdered tonight. This was gang-related, and we will bring these individuals to justice." Those words struck Stockton like a hammer. The nightmare that many residents thought they had left behind, the specter of organized gang violence, had returned with unprecedented brutality. Veterans of Stockton's past conflicts recognized the signs immediately. Multiple shooters, coordinated fire, a public location chosen deliberately to send a message. It wasn't just an attack, it was a declaration. But a declaration of what? In the early hours of the investigation, authorities struggled to answer that question. Detectives scoured surveillance footage from surrounding streets, hoping for a glimpse of the vehicles involved. The San Joaquin County Sheriff's Office confirmed what many feared. There were multiple gunmen, more than one person firing into the crowd. The level of organization suggested something larger than a personal dispute. Meanwhile, the FBI stepped in, joining local and county law enforcement in a sweeping manhunt. They offered a $50,000 reward for information leading to the shooters. That offer, unprecedented for a local gang case, underscored the scale of what had happened on Lucille Avenue. For Stockton residents, the message was chilling. If gunmen were willing to execute an attack of such scale at a child's birthday party, then nowhere in the city was safe. As investigators began their work, the families of the victims planned funerals instead of birthdays. Vigils sprung up across the city. Hundreds gathered at candlelit memorials, leaving teddy bears and drawings at the entrance of the banquet hall. Parents clutched their surviving children tighter. Teachers talked quietly among themselves about how to help students cope with trauma they should never have had to face. But beneath the grief, fear was growing. Residents whispered of retaliation, of rival gangs preparing to strike again. Community leaders warned that a gang war, something Stockton had seen before, but never at this magnitude, might already be underway. And they were right. The massacre on Lucille Avenue was not the end of the violence. It was only the beginning. In the days following the Lucille Avenue massacre, Stockton felt like a city holding its breath. Patrol cars swept through neighborhoods with their lights dimmed but engines roaring. Helicopters hovered after sunset, tracing circles above South Stockton. Schools sent letters home urging parents to keep children indoors after dark. Churches opened their doors for prayer even on weekdays. The sense of unease was unmistakable. Something was coming, and it didn't take long. Just 4 days after the birthday party shooting, Stockton was hit again. This time, the violence unfolded on a quiet residential street where families were preparing for bed. A silver sedan rolled slowly down the block, its headlights off. Witnesses later recalled how the silence of the night was shattered by a burst of gunfire, quick, precise, unmistakably deliberate. By the time neighbors stepped outside, the car was already disappearing around the corner, engines screaming as it fled. A woman lay in her driveway, struck by multiple rounds. She was pronounced dead at the scene. There was no party this time, no crowded banquet hall, no children running toward balloons, but the message was the same. Stockton was in the middle of something more coordinated, more ruthless, and more accelerating than anything officials had anticipated. The second killing wasn't random. It was part of a pattern forming so quickly that residents could barely keep up with the news reports. To many in the community, it felt as if a war had erupted overnight. Local television stations cut into regularly scheduled programming. Maps of shooting locations began appearing on screens. Anchors repeated the same phrases. Believed to be gang-related. Investigators are searching for multiple suspects. No arrests so far. Each update seemed to confirm what residents were already whispering. The massacre at the birthday party had opened the floodgates. Behind closed doors, law enforcement agencies scrambled to contain a crisis that was evolving faster than they could respond. Detectives sifted through shell casings from the banquet hall and compared them to the drive-by shooting. Crime scene analysts worked day and night, but the brazenness of the attacks complicated everything. These weren't isolated flare-ups. They were part of a rolling sequence of violence that suggested rival groups were making moves against each other, moves that bypassed the old rules of engagement. Historically, Stockton's gangs had operated with a kind of grim logic. As violent as the streets were, there were boundaries, warnings, negotiations, and a hierarchy that kept the most reckless impulses in check. But something about the late 2025 surge felt different. The willingness to strike a public family event, the coordination of multiple shooters, the rapid follow-up killing. It all pointed toward a new generation, ignoring the old codes, driven by fearlessness, desperation, or perhaps a power vacuum created within the city's gang structure. Residents felt the shift immediately. Mothers refused to let their kids walk to the store. Elderly neighbors peeked through blinds when cars idled too long. Store owners closed early, afraid of being caught in crossfire. community leaders held emergency meetings trying to make sense of the escalating danger. Former gang members appeared on local radio, warning that retaliation cycles can spiral out of control quickly, and that Stockton might already be in one. The San Joaquin County Sheriff didn't sugarcoat what his investigators found. At a press conference, he confirmed that the birthday party shooting involved multiple gunmen, not one shooter, not two, but a coordinated group arriving together, firing together, and escaping in a planned formation. This wasn't a chaotic outburst. It was structured, intentional, and chillingly efficient. That confirmation sent a chill through Stockton, because it meant the city wasn't dealing with a single trigger puller on a rage-filled night. It was dealing with an organized unit willing to unleash mass casualties in public, a unit that was still out there. The FBI's involvement only heightened the tension. When the Bureau announced a $50,000 reward for information, it signaled that federal agents viewed the violence as more than a local matter. They believed the shooters were part of a wider criminal network, one capable of repeating acts of mass violence. As federal agents fanned out across Stockton, knocking on doors and collecting surveillance footage, residents wrestled with the haunting possibility that the violence wasn't over. Memorials began appearing on street corners: flowers, candles, stuffed animals, handwritten notes. But memorials did little to ease the underlying fear. Not when sirens wailed nightly, not when gunshots echoed across neighborhoods where children once played outside until dusk. In community meetings, pastors begged for calm. Activists demanded intervention programs. Youth workers pleaded for more resources. But beneath the appeals, everyone understood the grim truth. Stockton was caught in a storm that showed no signs of passing. And behind that storm lay something deeper, something rooted in Stockton's long struggle with entrenched gangs, generational cycles, and the evolution of organized criminal groups. To understand why the violence erupted so explosively in 2025, one must look back to the old alliances, the old rivalries, and the long, bloody history of Stockton's street gang underworld. That history, decades in the making, would shape everything that was happening now. To understand why Stockton erupted in late 2025, you have to step back years, even decades, to see the landscape that shaped the city's present crisis. Stockton didn't suddenly become violent. It didn't wake up one morning consumed by gangs. The truth is harsher, more complicated, and more deeply embedded in the city's history. What unfolded in November and December of 2025 was the violent flowering of seeds planted over generations. Stockton has always been a crossroads, geographically and socially. Situated along major drug trafficking routes and marked by persistent economic hardship, its neighborhoods became fertile ground for the rise of criminal street gangs beginning in the late 20th century. Over time, the city saw an entrenched mix of Latino, Black, Asian, and hybrid gangs evolve, each shaped by shifting alliances, prison politics, and cycles of retaliation. Every era produced its own conflicts, and every conflict produced its own scars. By the early 2000s, Stockton's South Side had become one of the state's most violent regions per capita. Police struggled to contain a surge of gun crimes as gangs competed for territory, drug trade routes, and influence. The city responded with waves of enforcement operations, some successful, others merely temporary solutions that pushed violence underground before it resurfaced somewhere else. One of the most significant efforts came in December 2017, when the Stockton Police Department launched a massive crackdown dubbed the Criminal Gangs Takedown. More than 20 suspects were rounded up in a coordinated series of raids that targeted some of South Stockton's most violent gangs. The operation seized firearms, narcotics, gang intelligence, and several high-ranking members. For months afterward, residents reported feeling safer. But the reprieve was short-lived. When gang leaders are removed, power vacuums form. Younger, more aggressive members often step forward, unbound by the restraints that older generations respected. The removal of veteran shot callers can fracture a gang's internal structure, sparking rivalries as new factions seek dominance. In some cases, it can cause alliances to collapse entirely. That was the case in Stockton. By the early 2020s, the city's gang dynamics had shifted dramatically. Old crews splintered, new cliques formed. Lines between gangs blurred as young members drifted between affiliations, creating unpredictable and volatile landscapes. Law enforcement began calling them hybrid gangs, loose networks of younger offenders with shifting loyalties, armed with social media bravado and far less fear of the consequences than their predecessors. But the roots extend even deeper. Years before the 2017 takedown, Stockton had already been home to complex gang activity. One of the earlier, most notable cases was Operation Blue Fox, a sweeping investigation targeting the Tiny Rascals Gang, TRG, a predominantly Southeast Asian gang involved in everything from firearms trafficking to violent assaults. TRG had long been a major player in Stockton's criminal underworld, known for carrying high-powered weapons and engaging in coordinated acts of violence. Operation Blue Fox was a major federal-state collaboration aimed at dismantling their influence. It succeeded, temporarily. Many TRG members were arrested or federally indicted. But as in most gang crackdowns, the city didn't see lasting peace. Instead, factions of TRG splintered or evolved, while other gangs filled the void. New groups emerged, some inspired by prison gangs, others forged by neighborhood alliances or social media-fueled disputes. And through all of this, Stockton residents lived with the consequences. Neighborhoods became patchworks of invisible boundaries known only to those who lived there. Parents knew which blocks their children could walk down safely and which ones they couldn't. Schools created unofficial plans for dealing with gang-related tensions. Nonprofits and community groups tried to intervene, but limited funding and high turnover made sustained progress difficult. By 2025, Stockton's gang landscape was as complicated as ever, fragmented, unpredictable, and marked by a new generation who viewed violence as both survival and status. Some of these younger members came from homes surrounded by violence. Some had already lost friends or relatives to gang shootings. Others had spent months or even years under influence of older gang members who passed down grudges and codes through stories, tattoos, and online messaging groups. In this environment, feuds escalated quickly. A single insult on social media could ignite a shooting. A fight at a house party could trigger weeks of retaliation. When a high-profile gang member was arrested or killed, alliances shifted and cracks widened. And in November 2025, those cracks ruptured. Law enforcement experts would later suggest that the birthday party shooting was not simply a one-off event, but rather the eruption of one of these deep-rooted conflicts, possibly a retaliation or a message delivered by a faction seeking to assert dominance. The involvement of multiple shooters and the brutality of the attack aligned with a disturbing new trend. Young gang members willing to engage in military-style assaults with no regard for civilian casualties. This context, years of operations, takedowns, fragmentation, and a new unpredictable generation, helps explain why the late 2025 violence felt so explosive and so terrifying. It wasn't spontaneous. It wasn't random. It was the culmination of decades of pressure, rivalry, and systemic failures. And with the FBI now involved, Stockton found itself standing at the crossroads once again, caught between the weight of its history and the urgent need to stop a crisis spiraling beyond local control. As Stockton reeled from the violence of late November and early December 2025, law enforcement agencies knew they were facing one of the most critical public safety emergencies in the city's modern history. A mass shooting with multiple shooters, a second killing days later. A wave of fear sweeping through neighborhoods already strained by years of gang conflict. If the violence continued to escalate, Stockton risked falling into a full-scale gang war with casualties far beyond what the city had seen in years. It was in this climate of urgency that the FBI formally entered the investigation. When federal agents arrived, they brought with them advanced forensic capabilities, intelligence analysts, and a network of interagency resources that local authorities simply didn't have. At a press briefing, the Bureau announced a $50,000 reward for information, leading to the identification and arrest of the shooters responsible for the Lucille Avenue massacre. It was a number chosen not just to entice witnesses, but to send a message. The United States government now considered this attack a top-level priority. Behind the scenes, a multi-agency task force formed overnight. Detectives from the Stockton Police Department worked alongside federal agents, sheriff's deputies, analysts from the California Department of Justice, and gang intervention experts who had been monitoring rising tensions for months. Their first challenge was the most obvious and the most daunting: tracking down multiple shooters who had pulled off a coordinated attack with chilling efficiency. Surveillance teams combed through hours of footage from nearby streets, gas stations, and traffic cameras. Analysts constructed a timeline of the shooters' movements, reconstructing the attack minute by minute. Forensic experts matched shell casings to a range of firearms: semi-automatic rifles, handguns, and possibly even modified weapons. The crime scene told its own story. The shooters came prepared, knew exactly where to position themselves, and vanished before patrol units could respond. But solving the case would require more than forensic evidence. It needed cooperation from a community terrified into silence. That challenge became immediately clear. Many residents who lived near the banquet hall were hesitant to speak. Some feared retaliation from gangs. Others were wary of law enforcement after years of tension between communities and police. Even witnesses who knew crucial details struggled with the burden: fear for their safety, fear for their families, fear of being the next target in a city under fire. To break through that fear, Stockton leaders took to the streets. Mayor Christina Fugazi visited neighborhood centers, churches, and small businesses, urging anyone with information to come forward. Pastors held emergency meetings, asking congregants to speak up for the sake of the children who were killed. A coalition of community activists organized candlelight vigils not only to mourn the dead, but to push for unity in the face of violence. Their message was clear. This was not just a gang issue. It was a citywide crisis, and silence would only protect the killers. The push began working. Tips trickled in. Some were vague, unverified rumors, fragments of street gossip. Others were more substantial: descriptions of vehicles seen fleeing the scene, names whispered in the parking lots, hints about rivalries simmering beneath the surface. The task force chased down every lead, mapping potential connections between known gang factions, recent arrests, and emerging cliques forming in Stockton's most volatile neighborhoods. Yet the broader fight to prevent further violence required more than chasing suspects. Authorities needed to address Stockton's long-term gang ecosystem, the one that had produced the shooters in the first place. This forced the city into a two-front battle. On one front, law enforcement intensified patrols, added undercover operations, and increased pressure on gangs known to engage in retaliatory attacks. Specialized units were deployed near schools and community centers to reassure families. Officers walked footbeats in neighborhoods where residents had grown accustomed to staying indoors after dark. For many, the sight of increased police presence felt like a necessary shield during a frightening time. On the other front, community-based organizations redoubled their efforts. Violence interruption workers, many of them former gang members, met with youth on the brink of entering the streets. They visited hospitals where victims of gun violence were being treated, trying to prevent retaliation before it began. Mentorship programs held emergency sessions. Counselors met with families trying to process trauma, helping them understand that healing would be a long road. Despite these efforts, Stockton was deeply aware that stopping one set of shooters would not end the cycle. Residents had seen this pattern before: explosions of violence, followed by crackdowns, followed by temporary calm. The challenge wasn't just capturing the killers, it was breaking a cycle decades in the making. By mid-December, investigators believed they were closer to identifying key suspects. But even as progress was made behind closed doors, the city continued to grieve publicly. Vigils filled parks and parking lots. Prayer circles gathered on street corners. Teachers prepared crisis response plans for students struggling with fear and anxiety. Volunteers walked neighborhoods distributing flyers about counseling services and after-school programs. The city moved as one, wounded but determined.